So good afternoon, everyone.
Afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. So it is with great pleasure and anticipation, I welcome you all to the online panel discussion on the impacts of COVID-19 on the South Asian economy, initiated by the PGBM team, the British College, Kathmandu, Nepal. On behalf of our executive team, faculty members, and students, I extend a warm welcome to all the participants and express a sincere gratitude for accepting our invitation and providing us with your valuable time. Now, without wasting much of our time, I would like to move ahead with the introduction of our panelists. The first panelist we have amongst us is Dr. Valerie Merker-Blackmon. Dr. Valerie holds a PhD in economics from University of Pennsylvania, and she is currently a senior economist at the South Asia office of the chief economist, which focuses on policy-based research and regional trades in South Asia. Her recent publication research focuses on diversification, trade FDI productivity in services and global value chains. She has also worked as a macroeconomist at the Asian Development Bank, at the Caribbean Department of the Inter-American Development Bank, and on the Latin America and the International Monetary Fund. Welcome, ma'am. The second panelist, thank you, ma'am. The second panelist we have amongst us is Professor Dr. Achyut Wagle. Dr. Achyut Wagle holds a PhD in economics from the Indian Institute of Technology, Kanpur, and he is currently a professor at the Kathmandu University School of Management. He has also served as an advisor to the Prime Minister of Nepal. In Nepal, he is regarded as one of the seasoned analysts in the area of country's political economy. His core area of research is public finance in federal structure. Welcome, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
The third panelist we have amongst us is Professor Dr. Salim Rehan. Dr. Salim holds a PhD from the University of Manchester, United Kingdom, and he is currently a professor at the Department of Economics, University of Dhaka, Bangladesh. And he is also the executive director of the South Asian Network of Economics Modeling. He is the honorary secretary and a research fellow in the University of Manchester, United Kingdom. He is the alumni of the Harvard University program on cutting edge of development thinking. Dr. Salim possesses vast experience in empirical research on international trade, economic growth, poverty, labor market, macroeconomic policies, political economy, and climate change issues. Dr. Salim has worked for several national and international organizations, including the Asian Development Bank, the World Bank, UNDP, the Commonwealth Secretariat, European Commission, ILO, DFID, and many more reputed organizations. We welcome you, sir.
Thank you.
The fourth panelist amongst us we have is Dr. Paul Capek. Dr. Powell holds a PhD from the Center of Contemporary European Studies, and he is currently a senior lecturer in international business at Bristol Business School, University of West of England. His research explores independencies between international business strategies, operation, and regional development theory and practices, particularly in the context of emerging and transition economics. Welcome, sir.
Hello, good afternoon. I'm glad to be here.
Thank you, sir. The fifth and the final panelist we have amongst us is Professor Himanshu Rai. Professor Himanshu Rai is the director of IIM Indore, India. He specializes in negotiation, and his core teaching area include negotiation, leadership, and justice. His book entitled Negotiation, published by the McGraw-Hill's Education, is the bestseller on Amazon. His profile includes over 8 years at Tata Steel's India, where he played an essential role of developing quality systems and the communication policies for the company. Professor Himanshu has trained over 20,000 professionals, both in private sector as well as the government. He provides strategic consultancies to Government of India, and in particular, is audited programs sponsored by the Planning Commissions of India. He also provides strategic consultancy to the state governments in the area of restructuring, strategic human resource management, and employee development. An expert in international negotiation, he provides consultancy in negotiation to individuals and organizations. We welcome you, sir.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone.
All our 5 panelists will be discussing on the growing economic impact of the current crisis, the government responses, and the primitive actions required to get the South Asian regions back to its equilibrium. Having said this, I would like to invite Mr. Jagdish Prasad Best to further carry on with this program.
Thank you, Sajid sir, and welcome to this panel discussion of Betty's College. I welcome you all panel members here. So today we'll be starting it in the for 1 and 2 hours in an aggregate. So all the the participants who are watching us on Facebook Live and different social media platforms, I would like to make a note for you. If you have any queries to ask, please write them down in the comment box below. Right. So before getting started, let me put some light on what is going on this global scale right now. This COVID-19 originated in China, Wuhan, has spread all over the world by now. It's been a month and more that economies are shut. It is putting some harsh light on every economic sections worldwide. Stock markets are plunging, oil prices are plummeting like never before. These unemployment rates increasing every day. They are aggregating to millions number. And commodity markets are also falling down. Right, supply chain disruptions are there, whether we talk about cross-border supply chains or within a country itself. And most importantly, the South Asian region is not also intact. The countries in South Asian region are almost shut for a month and more now. And these countries, who include a larger portion of poor demography in their population, these are the people they are going to face devastation due to this COVID-19 here with us at the South Asia, right? So some of these peoples do not even have access to shelter. They do not even have disposable income for their medical care or daycare or to join their hand and mouth in a daily basis. People are stranded at the borders, and they are not able to get into their countries due to the fear of this COVID outbreak. So with these apprehensive statistics coming in every day worldwide, today at this platform of Betty's College, COVID-19 and South Asian economies, will be trying to put some light on some policy measurements and some actions that the government should take, and coordination and collaboration amongst countries at the policy level. So now let me start it with Dr. Valerie. She connects with us from Washington, D.C., World Bank. At this first round, we'll be talking about the individual countries that the panelists are from. So Dr. Valerie, either you talk about these numbers coming in as infected people, or these soaring unemployment applications every day, these months, they are aggregating millions in number. So what are these statistics telling us about US economy? I mean, where is this US economy headed right now? Can you please give us a snapshot of US economy right now?
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to this very interesting panel. So I was involved in the publication that came out to us recently, the South Asia Economic Focus, where we tried to look at the things happening in South Asia. And of course, there has been a lot of comparison with what is happening here, but I'd say that at some level it's very global. So some of the things that are happening in the United States are actually quite similar to what's happening in India, except that, or in South Asia, except that we have noticed, and this is true in the United States, and as you mentioned, it's true in South Asia, that the vulnerable are being hit the hardest. So even, I know we're going to discuss this more, but even though the virus does not discriminate across borders, or everyone is being affected, for many reasons, the people with more income can be better prepared. And that is also the case here in the United States. As you know, the gig economy and a lot of jobs that have been created in the services sector in the last few years have been jobs that have less protection, that have shorter contracts, that don't actually have contracts. And those are the people, and it is now being revealed that those are the people that are that are becoming unemployed. Here we have lines for people filing for unemployment insurance, which is the recourse that people have, but of course that doesn't mean that there aren't many others, especially in South Asia, that are actually becoming effectively unemployed. So in terms of the numbers, I think you've all seen the numbers of, unfortunately, the United States is leading in the number of cases and the number of deaths, and it's one of the most important things that we have found here. And you know, there are differences across states, but I think it also is a lesson for certainly for India, which has themselves have a federal system, but also for other countries, that you want to come in as early as possible. And if you actually look at when states here in the United States started to take action and the plateauing of the number of cases, it's a direct relationship with that. So I think that South Asia, as soon as the World Health Organization declared it a pandemic, very quickly started to take action. We have some data on that. And whereas, for example, India has 31 cases per million persons, and the United States has 3,582 per million persons as of yesterday. And all the other countries, India, which has, again, 31 persons per million that have actually active cases, that's still the largest number in the whole of South Asia, and actually slightly even smaller than China's, which is already plateaued. So the point to make is, I think that this is the first thing that we're watching, and I think in anything that we talk about, we have sort of thought it into two categories of things that you have to watch out for. First of all, we're in, as we all know, this is not normal. So a lot of the policies that would work in normal times, we have found don't work now. So everything is sort of turned upside down. And secondly, the policies that you take to reduce the health costs are, although a lot of people are saying, well, those are the ones that are actually affecting the economy. And as you know, here in the United States, there's a lot of there are a lot of back and forthing and discussions as to the fact that the lockdowns are actually creating the economic costs. But we tend to have a sort of disagreement, because we actually think, looking at what, at least for the case of South Asia, but certainly I think for some of the other countries that the World Bank has looked at, the short-term economic, the measures that you take at the beginning will in fact help you in the medium and long term in your economic costs. They will actually reduce your economic costs. So there's not necessarily a trade-off there. Certainly in the very short run there is, but not in the medium and long run.
Okay, Dr. Valerie, just a follow-up here. Like you said, current policy measurements are not working in this case. And do you mean this crisis that is looming is different than what we had in the past? Either we talk about 2008 and 2009 financial crisis, or go into retrospective in the past. It's different than what we had faced.
Yes, it's quite. First of all, I think already the indicators that are coming in, and most countries have 1 or 2 months of indicators are already saying that it's actually much worse. But I think there's two very big difficulties, and again, the second one is very important for South Asia. One of them is that demand has completely been restricted. There has been obviously artificially repressed. There is no demand, which is very unusual. Most of the recessions and global financial crisis, certainly, and some of the others that economists are used to, it's actually collapsing demand, collapsing investment. And the question that government has is, how do they revive that? How do they stimulate investment? Monetary policy has essentially been set up to try to regulate that. Here, that obviously won't work, right? There is no pumping money in to get people to spend. They can't spend even if they want to, obviously, except for essentials. And the second thing is that, whereas in the past, it's usually been manufacturing and the services sector, sometimes export sectors, if there's another country in the world that it's happening to, that begins to have the first declines when you go into a recession. Here it's actually the services sector. So, for example, we actually analyzed a little bit closer the most affected services sectors in South Asia, which are, of course, not only hospitality and restaurants, but also, for example, all of retail trade and all of the personal services, air transport, land transport, which is huge, and especially in India, land transportation, especially passenger transportation. All of these are completely shut down, or at least were for a while. So those are two very large differences that make not only the effects larger, but they also make solutions. It means we have to really think outside the box.
All right, thank you, Dr. Valerie. We'll be coming back to these influences on different industries. So let me turn it to Professor Salim from Bangladesh. And Professor Salim, we have been observing that Bangladesh is remarkably doing good in terms of economic growth for a few years now. Its average growth, if we see it is above 7%. That is remarkable. But this pandemic is expected to put a structural break here. The World Bank recently they have expected that it will come down below somewhere 2 or 3%. Right. So now, despite that, the government of Bangladesh is coming up with some stimulus packages, and recently it has come up with around 8 billion USD. Can you share with us what is going on in Bangladesh right now? What are the things over there, and what is economy is looking like these days?
Thank you, Jagadish. I thank the organizers for inviting me to this very, very important discussion. I think what Dr. Valerie, she mentioned about the kind of global context, especially one of the largest economies in the world, US economy. And of course, in Bangladesh, in South Asia, is a kind of, as you mentioned, Jagadish, that it has been growing at a high growth rate over the last few years. And the recent projection was that before the crisis, the country would grow more than 8%. But it's not happening. And the World Bank estimates and the IMF estimates, they're showing that the growth rate will come down to 2 to 3%. Despite the fact that actually government may not be actually willing to accept this figure, government probably is saying that the growth rate will be around 6%. But I think the debate about these numbers are not important. What is important and what everyone agrees on is that the major drivers of growth are badly affected in Bangladesh. And probably we'll have to wait and see to what extent this is going to have big impact on the economy. But I think, as you mentioned at the beginning, that it's going to have serious implication on the employment laws, serious implication on a major, stagnation of major economic activities, as well as poverty situation. So I think Bangladesh, we from Salim, actually we did a study very recently, and we have been mentioning that we came up with the estimates that Bangladesh may actually lose the kind of gain or the kind of gain in poverty reduction over the last 1.5 decades. And then country can go back to what the country was in 2005, the situation. That means the poverty rate can be doubled from 20% to around 41%. So this is going to be huge, because you are going to see a new set of people who are not poor, but now they have fallen into poverty. So, I'm quite sure that, in countries, in other South Asian countries, though at different degrees, the impacts are going to be the kind of, in similar directions. So here, the way the government, as Jagdish you mentioned, the government has responded in two ways, and like in many countries. One is that imposing the lockdown and then the stimulus package. And now the problem in South Asia is that I think you will also facing in all other South Asian countries. And Dr. Valerie can also share her experience from US. To what extent this lockdown actually being effective in countries like us? In Bangladesh, so far, it has not been proven as a kind of very effective, because the way I think the country followed a very much kind of European style or very Western style of lockdown, they did not really look into the kind of South Asian context or country context. So I think there was a research, it was needed at the very beginning to come up with very sector specific and regional specific protocol to, in the country like Bangladesh, what would be the feature of the lockdown. So this is, I think, one important thing which we missed that kind of the time, but I think there's still opportunities are there to kind of look at this. I just want to remind you, today we had the highest number of affected people in Bangladesh, 786 over the last 24 hours. And total affected people now has crossed more than 10,000. And then, I think so, and even the government is with the kind of pressure from different lobbying groups, for example, ready-made garments or different small shop owners, there is an initiative to open up the factories or open up the shopping malls, but which are not really consistent with this growing number of affected people. So I think this is, I would put as a big concern. But you're on the stimulus package, I just want to highlight, and I'll just stop here, that on the stimulus package, Bangladesh probably has announced one of the highest amount of stimulus package in terms of percentage of GDP in South Asia. It is close to 3.5%. And it is actually not $8 billion, it is more than $10 billion. So if you put together all these stimulus pack amount and as well as the amount declared for the social protection programs. But I think I want to highlight here, and I'm quite sure the other South Asian countries, they have the similar experience, that the countries, they don't have the experience of handling this huge amount of stimulus package. So here I just want to finish by saying that the effectiveness of the stimulus package in Bangladesh, and like in other countries as well, would depend on three areas. One, how do you really finance the stimulus package in a country where you have a very low tax GDP ratio? Second, how do you manage? Because here it comes more of a political economy perspective, because you need to ensure that the affected people and affected industries, they get the benefit out of it. And finally, how do you monitor it? Whether it is effectively implemented. I'll stop here, Jagadish, and I'll be happy to take further questions.
All right, thank you, sir. Now, let me turn it to Professor Rai. He connects us from India, Indian Institute of Management. Now, Professor Rai, being the largest economy in India, in South Asia, India is also likely to face devastation this year. And the projections are there that its growth rate will be somewhere 3 or 4 or 5%, somewhere between there. And so I just, in a snapshot here, I would like to request you to share with us about Indian economy and what is going on there these days.
Yeah, so first of all, Jagdish, I'll be extremely happy if the growth rate is 3 to 4%, like you said. I'm not too sure on that particular number because, if I look at numbers which are around, the best numbers which have been given to us are by the IMF, which is about 1.9%. Suffice to say, but like Salim pointed out, this is not the time to perhaps debate numbers. The more important thing is to see as to what can really be done, whether it is 1.9 or whether it's actually 3 is something that the future is going to tell us. But one thing is for certain, that what we have done so far has actually proven to work a little bit, but this is not a midterm or even a long-term solution. It's a short-term solution. Because if you look at the lockdown, so India has imposed a lockdown, and in fact, we have the second lockdown, which is currently in place. We are losing about $4.5 billion every day of the lockdown. And more than 50% of the businesses have been affected. Only about 1/4 of our $2.8 trillion economy is functional. But to me, the larger question and the larger issue, which is bothersome, the unemployment rate. Within a month, the unemployment rate jumped from about 6.5, 6.7% to almost 20%. Now, to me, the larger question and the more bothersome thing is what Valerie pointed out right in the beginning. What is the impact that it is going to have on the disadvantaged groups? So, people have been saying that COVID-19 and the pandemic does not differentiate between the poor and the rich. I'm sorry, but it does. It always does. And we in India are looking at it because we have a very large population of unorganized labor, which is the migrant workers, which move from one state to the other state to actually earn their livelihoods. And also about 28, 29% of our economy, which is dependent on MSMEs, the micro, small, and medium enterprises. Now, both of these have been hit badly. And therefore, what I'm more concerned about are 2-3 things. One is the migrant labor, which is now actually in the process of going back to their home states. What happens to them? Do they stay back in their home states, or do they come back again to the state where they were working once things are eased down, once things get better? Because there are certain sociological issues which have come in. So in India, for example, many of the villages have closed themselves because of the fear of the pandemic, and they're not allowing any outsider. In fact, some of the villages have told the people from the villages who had gone out to work that henceforth they should not go out, otherwise they will not be allowed into that village. So this is a big sociological challenge which needs to be addressed. And the second part is those states which are dependent on these migrant workers from other states. What happens to their work once you want to kickstart the economy? That is the important part. And the second thing is how to revive the MSME. Now, the government of India has done 2-3 very interesting things. One was the stimulus package, which was brought in timely. And there's another stimulus package which should be in its way, probably tomorrow and day after it should be announced. The second was that the lockdown is being opened. So the areas in India have been divided into red zones, orange zones, and green zones. And therefore, the lockdown is being lifted in a progressive way, depending on which zone a particular district falls in. But as Valerie pointed out, it's a very, very long road. And we are not even sure whether the curve is flattened or not. If you look at different models, they are all predicting different things. But what we are sure about is that the lockdown, whenever it is opened for a couple of days, then we are going to get the real picture as to what was the porosity during the lockdown, and are we able to maintain those hygiene standards and those physical distancing standards that we are speaking about on the opening of the lockdown. And if at all it leads to a spike, what is the kind of a spike, and are we really prepared for it? So I'll be looking very, very eagerly and very, very anxiously to the next 2 or 3 weeks to see how this thing pans out.
Oh, thank you, sir. Now, let me turn it to Professor Wagle from Nepal. Professor Wagle, you have been at the front line in either we talk about economics or the political economy for many years now. And Nepal is a country which is expecting to grow rapidly these years, but all of a sudden from nowhere, we have a lockdown here. It's been more than 40 days that every sector of the economy is closed. So how have you been absorbing this particularly the Nepali economy these days? I mean, it's not working with Professor Wagle.
You had not probably unmuted me, so I think it works. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you for having me in. So let me put things in context. That is, when we talk about the South Asian economy, we are basically talking about the Indian economy because out of, say, about $3.8 trillion South Asian economy, almost 3/4 of it is covered, occupied, whatever term you'd like to use, by India. So Nepal has got the strict pegging with the Indian currency. So it is one of the only country in the world who has got open border. So the several aspects shared by Professor Roy and Salim are applicable in our context as well. It may be, we are in the similar scenario. One of the things is very common to all of us is the uncertainty, that we clearly can see the very limited amount of testing, which is preventing us to evaluate the exact scenario, both in terms of economy and the potential hazard. Some people say we are sitting on the ticking time bomb and not being able to guess the extent of transmission that has already entered into the community level, or even ever the beyond community, across the community level. People say the third stage. In terms of number, as we all know, we have only so far 82 cases before I sat on this. That has increased now, I don't know. 82 confirmed cases, and then but the rate that is increasing along with as we increase the testing with more credible devices like PCR instead of the rapid diagnostic, that we all sit on a sort of volcano, I would say. That's the first thing. Second, I have very often said that the before IMF prediction that the global economy will be shrunk by 3 to 6%, I've said that this will be mother of all depressions. Even beyond Greater Depression. I have got those data. I don't want to bore with you that, but if there is time, I can share. Because most of the depressed sector, due to that, like the tourism, aviation, those all are already suffered a huge loss at the global level. So coming back to Nepal, the government has not so far announced any stimulus package in terms of the purse of the cash. So there has been some policy kind of incentive from the central bank that the interest payment can be delayed by 3 months. If you pay now, you can pay 10% less. And then the deadline for the installment payment has been postponed theoretically for 3 months. But these are not actually the stimulus package. But I again would like to build on what Professor Salim said, is even the government announces the stimulus package like the economy of Nepal, or that may be applicable in other South Asian economies as well. The absorption capacity of our institution to execute them in a very fair way, and our institutional efficiency, how we are going to distribute that in terms of relief, who need immediate help to support their families with adequate amount of nutrition, just for the survival, I would say. And as we all know, our large chunk of the population is clustered right above the poverty line. If the poverty from say $1.25 per day earning to $2, the number automatically doubles. The headcount poverty level automatically doubles. And this pandemic has created another kind of hazardous situation, if that may be the case. That is the way I'd like to put it. I think Nepal, Bangladesh, India, all have got a few specific characters of our economy. Particularly Nepal, if you look at in terms of the numbers of migrant workers that have gone out and the remittances they send in. Although India is the largest remittance receiver in terms of the nominal amount, like last fiscal year, it received like $84 billion. But in terms of GDP, Nepal is the largest recipient, like at the tune of say 28 to 30%. So what we are experiencing now is the very huge amount of layoff of these migrant workers, particularly in the countries of Gulf Cooperation region and the countries like Malaysia, there is a three eminent kind of dangers. One, these people want to come back home. We have got, we are to face a huge logistical nightmare to bring them home. If they want, you cannot say, I would not bring them, because they are, most of them are already laid off. There are more than 100,000 people already, staying there illegally when their visa expired, their work permit expired. That is applicable for the case of India also, who has got about 1.6, I think 16 million people in those countries.
So I think we have here disruption with the internet over there at your end. So I'll be coming back to you soon. Now, let me turn it to Dr. Powell. He connects us from United Kingdom. Dr. Powell, it's only been 100 days that UK economy is out of EU, European Union. And when the economy was, trying to normalize the effect of those Brexit and on its economy, all of a sudden, there is this pandemic coming in, and it is causing some disruptions in UK economy as well. Now, don't you think it looked like a havoc on UK economy? And now my point is, what is your view on these things right now? Both the things. One is Brexit effect, and another is this pandemic is there again.
I'm sorry. Should I continue? Jagdish, can you hear me?
Oh, I can hear you. So, but I think at your end there are some disruptions.
So, can I continue?
All right, sir. Yeah, you can.
Okay, I'll hold back then.
Can I continue?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay, that is the second challenge I'm talking about at the accommodating that. And the third challenge I see is the country like Nepal, which has got the trade deficit of like currency.
So can I come back to you in a later? Because I think there are some disruptions. Okay, Dr. Powell, now it is up to you.
Okay, so it's really interesting time here. Before I start answering your question, many congratulations to the British College for organizing this panel, and thank you very much for the invitation to join. But talking about Brexit and the pandemic in the UK, it's really quite peculiar, because for more than 3 years we've been hearing nothing else but Brexit. Whatever news channel you turn on at whatever time of the day, it was about Brexit. And all of a sudden, as at a switch of a button, the Brexit is gone. Brexit debate has largely been gone for almost 2 months now. The only mentioning of Brexit came in a form of starting the negotiations or restarting the negotiations between UK and the EU as to what is meant to happen after 2020, when we effectively finished the phase-out period. But in a sense, the pandemic gives an interesting way out for the Brexiteers. They're still pushing on. The Brexiteers are pushing on for the exit. There's no discussion about extension to the phase-out period at all. They're still pushing for the end of the phase-out period at the end of 2020. And in comes the pandemic with the complete closure of the economy. And Brexit becomes sort of secondary topic. So it gives quite a lot of space for those negotiating, quite a lot of leeway for those negotiating, because they're out of scrutiny. There's very little scrutiny of the negotiations ongoing at the moment. That's first. Second, there's the issue of course, the threat that Brexit will bring to the British economy and the negative consequences of it. The pandemic almost provides a circumstance when some of the consequences of Brexit will be and may be assigned to the pandemic rather than the Brexit itself. That's in sort of in political term, and forgive me if I'm a little bit skeptical, sound a little bit skeptical here. But of course, in real terms, what the pandemic does and will do economically is to further emphasize the negative aspects of Brexit. So not only the economy has been growing quite slowly, was very little investment, particularly in the corporate sector, over the past 3 years due to the uncertainty of how Brexit will look like and when will it finally happen. But on top of this, we have the significant slowing down of the economy, of British economy, without any clear direction of how to leave the current lockdown. We're meant to be hearing more from the government in the coming days. I'll leave it on that.
Thank you, Padre. Now, Achyut sir, it is up to you if you can make a short note here.
Okay, I'll just, I was talking about the third point. We'll have a pressure on balance of payment situation. That is, and that was, I was talking in our case, Nepal's case. The second aspect I would like to talk about, the disruption of the value chain, the international value chain. As I said, we have largely become import-dependent economy. So when the borders are closed, another key aspect is the employment. Only the case of Nepal, the proportion in all of our economies, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, or even Nepal, it is huge. Like Nepal, we claim that about 2/3 of the employable population is occupied with the agriculture sector, whereas the GDP contribution of the sector is very limited, like say 20-22% now. Same thing with India, I guess. It occupies 44% of the workforce, contributing only 16% of that. So that is a challenge. It is particularly, it is going to be more challenging when those migrant workers, where they are said to be in about 4 million, at least 4 million people abroad, and they come back. And as Professor Raya said, the aspect of internal reverse migration, I would say, from cities to villages. When they lost the employment opportunities, certainty, all those people have now gone back to the villages, putting more sort of stress on already overcrowded agriculture. If Nepal is unable to create some sort of package designed to create more gainful employment in the agricultural sector, it is going to be an additional problem. So when I see the role of the government here, I would like to add 3 key things. There must be some cash stimulus for the people who are socially very insecure, whose social security system is very fragile in itself, and just to sustain them, just to help them survive. That is one. Second is the agriculture, as I said, that the maintenance of the value chain. Third, I think, is the looking into the some aspect of giving some support to unemployed people. I think that another key aspect, it is applicable for entire South Asia, is the patterns of urbanization we have so far seen. The urban infrastructure. and then the urban poverty. If you look at India, we often take example of the Delhi slum of Dharavi of Mumbai, or in our case, the homeless people settle across the bank of several rivers. So that is going to be, I think, a new challenge, even coming out with the relief package. In terms of resources also, I think we need to rethink whether the support given by multilateral agencies, based on some formula of standard drawing rights of the IMF, or some packages announced by the World Bank for developing and underdeveloped countries, or ADB for that matter. I think that is going to be, that is not going to be enough at all, given the size of the problem we have, particularly the very poor infrastructure. If you look at the current scenario in Nepal, our testing process has virtually stopped because we don't have the testing kits, and the government is not able to procure the testing kit, and it is not there is not very credible kind of assurance from the government that it is coming in a week's time or so, the additional amount of testing kits and personal protection equipment for the medicos and all. So the resources are also going to be a problem. Again, I will come back.
Can I come back with you on policy
we can talk it later.
All right, thank you, sir. Now let me put it to Dr. Valerie again from the World Bank. Dr. Valerie, some of the South Asian countries who are mostly dependent on this, either we talk about the tourism sector or service sector economies, they are now, there has been debates that we cannot in an individual way, any country cannot fight it alone. So there should be a collaboration or the coordination amongst the countries, either we talk about South Asia or other part of the world. So how have you been absorbing these collaborations between the South Asian economies to fight this pandemic back?
Yes, sorry, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, yes, so yeah, thanks very much. So yeah, I very much agree with everything that's been said in terms of the extent and the fact that, in the last speaker, some of these multilateral organizations, it is true that there is just, the extent of this pandemic is so large that I don't think anyone's able to come up with the kind of money that would be needed. I mean, we talked before about how is this different from another global financial crisis. What tends to happen even in a natural disaster, in a global financial crisis, is that it's regionalized, right? There's one area of the world or one locality that suffers the most. So all the other places in a country or in the world can come to the rescue of that. So on your question on tourism and the services sectors, yes, we actually did some analysis of that in the recent report that we did. We actually think that there is a worst case scenario where the following happens. The lockdown can go, we had our lower and upper bound projections. And the reason why we did that is because we said, well, there's so much uncertainty about what can actually happen that instead of having a point or a central forecast, we decided to go with a range projection. And under that situation, the assumption is that there would be lockdown for between 2 and 4 months, which seems to be some places are opening up, but it seems to be sort of the average lockdown period for at least some of the European countries and some of the other places. And then we thought of a worst case scenario in which, for some reason, that doesn't work, and you actually have a spread afterwards, and then you have to have a second wave. So essentially, the rest of the year, the rest of the 2020 calendar year is completely lost as a result. And then you actually do get negative growth, which is unprecedented for 40 years in the region. And so that's where we think that if that can be avoided. So in other words, yes, the lockdown is something that we're just listening to epidemiologists. I think the economists and the politicians have done it sort of set themselves aside and have listened to what the epidemiologists are saying. And what they're saying is no healthcare system, not even New York City, can possibly deal with the kind of, deaths and destruction that would happen. So the lockdown is, given our technology, the only thing we can do. So that is what is going to affect the services sector, right? The tourism sector, the hospitality sector, the retail trade, all of these people have essentially been told everything you do has to be completely shut down. In the best of both worlds, and if we were thinking about how to best deal with this, you would actually try to call it a pause, a hibernation. Nobody's buying, nobody's selling. We're just taking a vacation, so to speak. And of course, it's nothing like that. But the point is that you try the cash advances and everything, and the postponements of a lot of tax payments, the postponement of debt payments that have been happening a lot in South Asia and in many countries, and indeed not enough for everyone. Trying to get food to people, that's the most important. Making sure that the food lines are open, the borders are open, that you have food security as much as is possible, that bottlenecks are closed down. That created a lot of chaos at the beginning, and things are not perfect, but I think a lot of that has actually been improving, and you can see that through prices of goods. There is unfortunately countries that are beginning to put export restrictions, but in general, we think that that's the most important thing. So then you have these services people that are not simply going to be opening up. Even a country that is able to open up immediately is already taking many steps, like the number of people that can go into the stores. So the kind of business that we had before, the normalcy that we had before, is going to take a long time to restore. Essentially, here in the United States, people think that it may happen until there's a vaccine. And again, in the United States, because for whatever reason, this leadership here has decided to take, every state has been doing has had to take care of their own situation. You actually see a lot of differences across states. It doesn't work perfectly because there's contamination. It's not. We've not been able to be as I think rightly strict in for example in India, where people can't leave their locality. So now again, many people might deny that, but that's the way that it's been dealt with. So I think in terms of the collaboration, there's two things that are important in South Asia, I think. Of course, you have India, which, as somebody mentioned, is 78% of the gross national income of Asia. So what they do is going to be absolutely key for the rest of South Asia, especially, for example, for Nepal and Bhutan, that do have a lot of remittances, going both ways. And so the decisiveness in which the Indian government came in, I mean, some people argued that there was such little time between the announcement of the lockdown and the actual lockdown, and all these migrants were stranded. You had complete chaos, people having to walk back to their villages. So the first 3 or 4 days that were completely chaotic did, however, give people the chance before there was a local contagion, before it spread. It allowed people to at least sort of settle back into where they were going to be, knowing that social distancing would be extremely difficult in urban areas. So that leadership did allow at least, I think, the spread to be contained. In Bangladesh, you are seeing, as Salim mentioned, there's still increases. I think Bangladesh was a little bit later coming in, and they do have the livelihoods coming in from the RMG sector that people were reluctant to close, etc. So, but then now you're beginning to see that that's a little bit more difficult to close, even though the numbers are still fortunately fairly low. So, I bring in the numbers and everything, but I think that if it can be, if the cooperation can be in, for example, keeping the food supply chains open. There were some cases in which there were some borders being closed. That is absolutely essential. And when you actually saw, for example, in Bhutan, in the case of Bhutan, they had closed some border because they obviously didn't want people to come in from other countries, but then they realized, no, we actually need to completely open it for goods, and we need to check the truckers, etc. And that attitude actually helped enormously in improving food security. There will be food security issues anyway, including, for example, there's a locust infestation already that's hitting Afghanistan and Pakistan. So it's very unfortunate, and there will be many sort of uncoordinated failures. possibly from some of the deliveries, but I think all of those things are going to be more short term, hopefully. So to the extent that the government and from my understanding from here, the government has been making sure, in general, that these goods are allowed to flow, these essential goods are allowed to flow, including across borders, right? Including exporting and importing to other countries, because, for example, Wuhan already has China has already gotten at least mostly to the other end. So has a lot of East Asia. So now they're going to be able to come and help South Asia and other countries that are suffering now. So there's a little bit of a if you can stagger this could help the whole world globally to recover this from the pandemic.
Thank you. Oh, thank you, Dr. Valerie. Now, when we talk about these leadership and collaboration amongst the South Asian countries, let me put it to Professor Rai from India. Professor Rai, you have been researching largely on these leadership and negotiation. Now, with hindsight that we have right now, do you think how do you think leaders of these South Asian countries are doing? Do you think, is there any crisis that we have on the leadership kind of things, or they are doing good?
You know, I'm not too sure if it is in my place to make a sweeping judgment on how the leaders are doing. But what I can say is that, and not just in the hindsight, I mean, I've always believed that this region is very, very unique when we talk about South Asian region. And of course, India has to play a certain role, given the fact that we have, we account for almost 78% of GDP. What I believe is that leadership has to be more inclusive and more responsible. And there has to be a lot more collaboration than we have had so far. And that to me is going to be the key going ahead. So for example, within our country, we have managed to do a few things. So for example, direct payment was made into the bank accounts of a whole lot of people. And yet, given that we are 1.3 billion strong, there will be people, and those numbers would probably be in millions, who will get left out. Now, whether we like it or not, whether we want it or not, they will get left out. Now, what do we do about those people is one of the big questions. Now, I'm a little, under trepidation, given that everyone apart from me on this panel is an economist, and therefore I have to be very, very careful with what I speak. But I believe, and it was one of the questions also which was pointed out, and Valerie also hinted at that the bigger question is that of demand. How will you create demand? And therefore, my suggestion would be print money. Just print money and give it in the hands of the people. Of course, there will be inflationary effects, but there are going to be inflationary effects any which way. What is more important is that even though we may be in hibernation, there has to be some kind of economic activity which has to continue. And to take that kind of a decision, I think needs a very decisive leadership. So that is one part of it, which is leadership within the country. And I'm sure that with the way the leadership of this country has decided to open gradually by converting areas into these zones, there is going to be some kind of thought which is going, which will go into it. But coming back to the regional leadership, I think we need more regional collaborations. So for example, I think on March 16 itself, our Prime Minister, Mr. Narendra Modi, had proposed an emergency for COVID-19 for SAARC nations. Now, similar such things need to be done. In fact, there used to be a body which was established in 1998, but for some reasons, it no longer exists. But we need more financial cooperation. We need to pool some of the resources. So for example, when Nepal talks about not having enough testing kits, perhaps neither do we. But this is a time when we should pool resources like testing kit. We should pool resources like the PPE. We should pool resources, even the human resources, like the doctors, the paramedics, the ambulance drivers. And this is going to be a time where it is going to test whether this region stands together, or do people start thinking only about their country? Because if you start thinking in unitary terms, then there's no limit to it. Then I might as well start thinking only about my housing quality. Somebody might start thinking only in terms of the cities. And this is not how we'll be able to face a pandemic which is of a magnitude of this. So I think the initial advancement or the initial proposal which has been made by the Prime Minister of our country, that needs to be taken beyond. And all the leaders of the South Asian countries, they need to come together, and more importantly, the inclusive actions that are decided upon should be very, very quickly put into action rather than being just on paper.
Thank you, sir. Now, I would like to turn to Professor Salim from Bangladesh. So, may I request you to conclude or make your note within a few minutes, 3 or 4. Now, when Professor Rai talked about this printing money, if I'm not mistaken, I think South Africa or these countries are trying to print some money to fight these COVIDs back. What do you think, how the countries like South Asian countries, Nepal, or who have already high level of inflation, and how it will be putting much more pressure on their economies if they go for printing money and funding these requirements at this time?
Jagdish, thank you. Before I get into the printing money issue, I'll just very quickly touch upon that regional cooperation, which is, I think, very important, and the way you have gathered the very distinguished panelists. I think there are 4 areas of regional cooperation here. First is, of course, I must congratulate Indian Prime Minister for taking the initiative, because the SAARC process was kind of dead, but now you have this in the crisis time. You have this joint emergency fund. I think this is first a very, very right kind of move, and we sincerely appreciate that. But this has to be expanded. This has to be used in a kind of right way, so that we can extend the cooperation the way the deadlock was there in regional cooperation. We can actually break the deadlock. Second thing, I think the major area now is the cooperation in the health sector. I think very rightly, my friend from Nepal, he said that actually if you lack probably testing kit, but in pharmaceutical industry in India, in Bangladesh, they are now producing testing kits. So I think there is a way of cooperating each other and using the same medical facilities. And why don't you create a pool of South Asian medical facilities? Now, how we can actually get the help from each other? I think this is something very important. And here I'd like to just quote one important point which was mentioned by Dr. Ganeshil Wignaraja from Sri Lanka. He also mentioned that South Asian countries can also collaborate on generating this vaccine, because in the vaccine, it can be very expensive from outside, but the research and innovation which is being now employed to develop this vaccine, the South Asian countries can be, the people can be benefited out of it. And the third area I can see, because overall we can see the global value chain is being seriously disrupted, global trade has been seriously disrupted. Why don't you emphasize on using our regional value chain, regional supply chain? That will actually give the boost to this regional trade, inter-regional trade. I think this is a high time now we do that. And my very final point of these 4 areas of regional cooperation, all of these countries, they are having this stimulus package. We must need to actually exchange our experience of how we are using our stimulus package, especially given the weak institutional environment, as rightly pointed out by some of the distinguished panelists. How do you actually handle this big stimulus package? Now, coming back to your point on the printing money. In Bangladesh, this is also very highly debated. I think after Nobel laureate Abhijit Banerjee, he suggested that the printing money, go for printing money. And then this has become a kind of hype also in Bangladesh. My point is that, yes, we should consider it as one of the options. I can see 4 options of financing the stimulus package. First, we must cut down unnecessary government expenditure, because many of the South Asian countries, they have very unnecessary government expenditure, which the government must assess and cut down. So this is first thing. Second, I think countries should actually explore the possibilities of external financing through like applying from loan from World Bank or IMF or Asian Development Bank. You need to explore the possibility too. Third, you have to see to what extent you can actually have domestic financing through your financial institutions, bank and other institutions. And if all these 3 options are exhausted, definitely you have to print money. My point is that if you bypass all the options and go for printing money, you will print money to finance your unnecessary government expenditure. You will print money to finance unnecessary expenditure. So I think this is something in the context in a country where in the institutional environment, weak institutional environment we are facing, this may backfire with even if you have a good intention. So I think we need to understand this situation. Definitely printing money is an option, but it is not the only option. We have to explore other options too. I'll stop here. Thank you, Jagdish.
All right. Thank you, sir. Now, can I, turn it to Professor Wagle from Nepal? So I would request you to make a note here within a few minutes, 4 or 5 minutes. So when we talk about the collaboration in South Asian countries, and recently, like Salim sir and Professor Rai issued point that SAARC country, yes, of course, we have one fund, a collected fund here, initiated by the Honorable Prime Minister of India, Mr. Narendra Modi. But questions are coming in, and they keep on coming that the proper utilization and the coordination amongst the leader in South Asia is the major issue here. Now, can you put some light on here?
Thank you. First of all, thank you, Jagdish. First of all, let me highlight the fact that the South Asia has been the economically least integrated regions, despite the SAARC is becoming a 4-decade world in a year's time, in a couple of years' time. So we must keep in the fact that this is not the time to dig into the what didn't work.
There are some issues
that is there. Regarding the fund, creation of the fund, I think we need to first validate that fund. That has just been symbolic. $10 million is nothing. But if South Asian countries are actually willing to cooperate, and then that can be a big basket, like the European Union has just started yesterday. So other development partners, willing countries to support the South Asia can come in. There is not even a very outright forthcoming sort of behavior from the individual governments as well to put money into this fund. So that is one aspect. Another I would like to emphasize here, we are very much dwelling on the phrase new normal without probably defining what are the possibilities of that new normal. I think we are entering into a very important phase of defining that. When we talk about printing money, are we giving unnecessary authority to the government to do whatever they like to serve only a high echelon of the people and the political class?
So I think I should come back to you later, sir. It's there are some disruptions here.
Because I think it's just a momental. I think if you can hear, I can probably continue.
Now I can hear you.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay.
Yes, sir.
So what I'm trying to say is, when we say new normal, we'll probably giving extra authorities to the governments to print money. Now, even there is a question of surveillance using digital techniques, eventually allowing governments to be more dictatorial. And the third aspect, we are probably losing the social capital. Was very subtle in saying that we are seeing some kind of stigma to certain communities with regard to infection, which has nothing to do with any religion or community. But those sort of social capital we need to preserve, that the idea of coexistence must be there. And then there are other kind of priorities. We need to prioritize our South Asian issues of the economy, like hunger. If we are not being able to maintain the supply chain, that means now lockdown must be effective, but they need to manage properly. It should not be selective for some. We probably need to learn to cohabit, if that is the word I should use, cohabit with the COVID-19, because we don't know when actually everything, the fear, all the fear and apprehension about this pandemic and contagion would be over. So every government, regardless of its ideology or anything, need to plan simultaneously to take forward the containment measures for the spread, to contain the spread of the virus, and then to run the economy with a particular focus on reinstating the economic value chain. I would like to emphasize here the economic value chain, because it is critical both ways, given the structure of our economies, which are largely dependent for employment on agriculture, informal sector, the small and medium enterprises we are talking about, which constitute about the 75 to 80% of the economic activities, including the self-employment to everything. So on that part, all the government needs to refocus the agricultural value chain. If you have seen the scenario, now we are killing the 2 cycles of the economic productivity. Now when the farmers are about to harvest, they are not being able to harvest. Their vegetables, their ready to harvest crops are in the field, and that is creating a sort of the fear of food insecurity in the first cycle. Next, we are unable to provide the agricultural inputs like fertilizers, seeds, which is the plantation season for all across the region. And if that is again going to be a problem to supply the agricultural inputs at this stage, we are going to have another problem of food supply in the entire region. So and now let me just very briefly touch upon the printing money. I think we have got a very huge fiscal space. If you look at in terms of a GDP debt ratio, if you look at India, its debt to GDP ratio is only 68%. If you look at Nepal, it is barely 30%. That is big space. We have got the scope of printing money. Not even if you think of the developed countries, we have got the debt to GDP ratio more than 100%. Some have got even 200% of that ratio. So, but again, I would like to come back is the governance part of it. Governments being accountable to what they are doing. But this is the time. This is the time all accountability mechanisms are suspended. And when I say there is a fiscal space, we have got the scope of reorienting our expenses, because all of the development projects are not going to go. All the workers that have left cities are not going to come back right away. Even in case of Nepal, we believe that about 2 million workers left the cities in the matters of months to go to their villages. I think in India, it is in millions, although there is no very systematic data. The new terminology has come as the precarious proletariat, precariat, who do not have any support, who do not have any means of support to their life, and no means to have a shelter in the cities when this sort of crisis hit. There is nobody for them to support. So I think this is the gloomy scenario. But again, I see this is also an opportunity to look into in a very, it might sound subjective. It is time to look into the basic Buddhist, Islamist formulas of economics, like coexisting with nature, being generous to the people where they are in need, maintaining the social harmony, and the adhering to our principles, ideals of social coexistence. And there are scopes. 3 scopes I definitely see is the modernizing the agriculture. This is perhaps the time, since we don't have other areas to invest, to revitalize our entire health services, health infrastructure, invest more on that. So, and it is also trying to rethink about the deep digital divide we have. We are now in developed countries, we are talking about the e-commerce, e-banking, online teaching. It may be applicable in some cities, but the huge digital divide is very apparent. It has come to surface, and we need to address that. And there are greater narratives being discussed. Is it the end of the globalization? It is the end of the market capitalism? Is it the end of the free market economy? Now, are we going back to the regulated economy with new Keynesianism? I think these debates will remain. But for now, the focus should be saving the lives from the pandemic, from the hunger. And it is time to recognize there has been a very brutal level of inequalities, economic inequalities, three sets of inequalities: income inequalities, wealth inequalities, and inequalities to the services even we claim to have in our system. So these things have come to fore. I think we need to now recognize in planning, in making the budgets. I see a lot of questions coming into chat box, particularly addressed to several
So we will be
panelists.
coming on some policy and these implications in a while.
I'll be happy to talk about that when they come about. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, let me welcome here Mr. Sajid sir. Sajid sir, it is over to you. I think you are muted.
Thank you, Dr. sir. So it was a very healthy discussion. And to start off with, I will start off with Dr. Powell. Dr. Powell, is there any probability of decline in remittance which flows from Europe to other countries? And where do you think the European economy will head towards after this situation?
It's difficult to predict where the European economy will go after the situation. You know, we're only at the best in some countries halfway through the pandemic. So I think any predictions and scenarios seem a little bit premature at the moment. In some countries, the lockdown is still very firm, including in the UK. Some other countries have slowly in stages begun to opening up their economy. So I think it's a little bit too early to talk about where the European economy will go after this. Of course, the European Union have put together a very strong stimulus package, and on top of what the individual countries have implemented as well. As far as the relationships and whatever is going on in Europe, how will it influence the rest of the world? I think that there's two areas of impact that I can think of. I mean, the first of course is in the context of international business, the consideration of global supply chains, and of course the stop of the demand or the halting of the demand within Europe, all across Europe, has had significant impact on supply chains that are stretching particularly into Southeast Asia or South Asia. And that is something that will need to be revived after we start moving out of the lockdowns across the European continent. So that's first significant impact that I can think of. And those breakdowns in supply chain, I don't think that they're necessarily impacting everyone in a fair way, in the same way. Because what we've been seeing is many of the Western companies, whether it's European companies or American and Canadian companies, some Australian large brands, when they started canceling the orders, predicting a drastic drop in demand several months back, they started canceling these orders, providing little compensation to their suppliers. So I think it'll be interesting to see how this relationship that has been strained between the big buyers, the big brands, the big retailers, or the big producers in the West, and their supply base, how those relationships will develop in the post-pandemic business world. And secondly, of course, that's outside of business is the help, is the financial aid. The European institutions, but more generally, multilateral institutions can offer to South Asia. So we have Valerie from World Bank, IMF have some ideas about this, European Union, as well other multilateral organizations. How do they deal with providing financing to South Asian economies, or whether it's in direct terms, provide additional loans, or perhaps this is a good time to start reconsidering restructuring of the old debt of those economies. Of course, not in a type of uncontrolled scenarios. You need to be cautious and avoid some sort of moral hazard scenario, but that's something that perhaps should be reconsidered in the developmental terms that you know, all the speakers have been so eloquently explored.
So thank you, Dr. Powell. And getting back to Dr. Valerie. Dr. Valerie, as per the recent press release released by the World Bank in the month of April, it was mentioned that due to this COVID-19, the remittance flow in South Asia is basically expected to fall by around 22%. In such a scenario, how the migrant remittance can be improved in spite of falling capital market flows and the foreign direct investments?
Yes, indeed. I mean, the remittances, I know Nepal, about 28% of their GDP is remittances, and many other countries depend on that. And about a large part of it, of course, is from Middle Eastern countries, oil producing countries, and some of it from the European countries, European and the United States. So we looked at that, and the very unfortunate part of it is that in the past, again, like everything else in other crises, there has been some external force that can always come to the aid, come to help. But remittances are an example in which we think, and certainly, or we already have projections of a 22% decline of remittances go from international remittances into South Asia, and the reason for that is mostly because a lot of the workers are working in oil-producing countries. As you'll know, oil prices have really plummeted, and there will simply not be the kinds of work they do in construction in oil may not be available. That's it. On the other hand, there's also the countries where the migrants are right now are coping with their own situations, and it's not clear, and there hasn't been a lot of clear direction over, even though in some cases there have been announcements as to what is going to happen with those workers. Now, clearly, most of those workers want to come home. And the fear, of course, is that some of them will, if the pandemic lasts for a long time, the fear is that they will want to come home and bring their savings, and then it's going to be very difficult for them to go back out. So if, for example, we knew, and of course we don't, we definitely know that this is not going to happen, but if there was a crystal ball that said, well, everything will be over in 2 months, then some of the migrants may be able to stay there and sort of at least hold on for a while until they can start work again. It's not clear that that's going to happen, unfortunately. For example, many migrants from Bangladesh and Singapore, some of them have actually been the ones that have been contagious the most. It was sort of a much more contagion in the quarters where they live. And so this is not only in the past, when we looked at remittances flows, that would be, for example, 1 year in which, you know, there may not have been so many people who emigrated and who started work, or some of the large projects in Saudi Arabia, in some of the Middle Eastern countries may have closed. So you had a small decline in the number of migrants that were working, but the total cumulative remittances were always growing fairly well, or maybe not growing as quickly, but they're always growing. And in this case, we're actually not going to see that. Now, I think at this point, the 22% decline projection that's been done, and we have a very big group in the World Bank that looks at this, is quite probable for 2020. And the big question, of course, is what's going to happen thereafter. And what we're trying to say to all the countries is that they need migrant workers. Migrant workers, I mean, again, like many other things that have happened in life in general, we begin to realize what are the things that really matter. And you know, the contribution of remittances to the South Asian economies is huge, especially to the smaller ones. And it was always a very stable and very non-volatile contribution. And like, for example, FDI and some of the other capital inflows. So this is a concern. And the other unfortunate issue is, again, although on the one hand, the very low oil prices, as long as they're stable, is going to be a very important, have a positive impact in South Asia, because we know we've actually done calculations about, you know, for every 1% drop in the oil price, that could be like a 7% improvement in, for example, the terms of trade. So these things are going to really could actually help, for example, free up some of the fiscal space to use it on, for example, cash transfers and things like this. So that's good. But on the other hand, unfortunately, a lot of the migrant workers are in countries where large oil exporting countries. I just wanted to come in on the issue of, if I may, on monetary policy just before moving on. And one of the problems with monetary policy, and yes, indeed, a lot of the countries have actually been expanding monetary policy, and there is room for monetary policy expansion because inflation, and especially core inflation and inflationary expectations, have been very good in South Asia and in general. So there's definitely room, and the central banks have ways to do that, and they have been doing it. So there's no question. Unfortunately, it's not as effective as it is in normal times, right? Because nobody's buying. It's not that people, you know, don't have the money to buy things. It's just that they're not even allowed to go and do so. And so it's a question really of making sure that liquidity conditions are not tight. And just getting us through this situation right now, so that and making sure, for example, that you can do cash transfers to the to targeted people, that those things are not affected. Of course, the fiscal is very important too. But I think so. Monetary policy, I think, yes, it is important to do so. It's just not clear how effective it is going to be now. It will be very effective once we begin to come out of the recession. Then I think the build up there, as people start to get back to work and everything, I think that will be more important. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Valerie. Now I get back to Dr. Himanshu, right?
Just to add a point to Valerie, just a single point.
Yeah, sure, sir.
As he rightly mentioned about the monetary policy, I think there is enough space in South Asian countries for fiscal policy. I think expansionary fiscal policy, not necessarily need to rely on the monetary policy part. And it is very right. But one point I wanted to add is on the liquidity position. The liquidity position might change overnight, given the fact that the large depositing institutions might need to withdraw in a very short run because of the non-productive kind of expenditure and retaining the employers without producing. So liquidity position might change, but still I think it is my reiteration of my earlier statement that there is a space of fiscal space which should be enough for at least for a year, I guess. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Waghli. Quickly getting back to him, Dr. Himanshu Rai. Indian economy has been growing over the last 2 decades, as we were discussing from the beginning of this discussion. The growth has been more unequal in countries than in most of the other parts of the world. Now, according to the recent Oxfam report, it has mentioned that income inequality gets worse in India, as India's top 10% bag 77% of the country's wealth, and 73% of the wealth generated goes to the richest 1%. India is the top remittance recipient country, which amounts to almost 80 billion US dollars. Migrants workers are coming back to the country. Slum areas are being difficult to manage. In this scenario, what pressure do you think will this create towards Indian economy? And what type of policy should government of India come ahead with this to overcome this scenario? Dr. Himanshu.
Okay, so that's a very valid point, Sajid. And this is going to be a challenging time for the government to come up with a policy which is coherent in the sense of addressing the problems that you pointed out. So I think there are 2-3 issues which will actually determine the response of the government. One is what is this revival rate of the domestic market itself post the pandemic? I'm not even talking about how long this pandemic is going to last, because all of that would be shooting in the dark. But once, as and when it happens, how quickly can we revive the domestic market? Number 2, what ought to be the focus area? So for example, while the pandemic is on, I still see a silver lining. So I see there's a huge scope for increasing inputs so far as the research and development is concerned, so far as digital services are concerned, so far as health tech is concerned, so far as pharmaceutical industry is concerned. So therefore, there are 2 things which become important. Is the government going to spend money on these areas, which are going to be areas which clearly need money as of now and are actually doing well? Number 2, to what extent do we make our country attractive for others to bring in their money? See, right now there's a pressure, and this pressure is more of a socio-political economic pressure on other countries. So we can't expect FDIs because there's a pressure on the organizations as well as individuals to spend money within their own country, given the lockdown. And I don't think anybody can do anything about that pressure. But once that pressure is lifted, how do we make ourselves more attractive? Because clearly there is also going to be some element of moving money and moving trade from, and moving also your outsourced in the industry kind of thing from some countries to another set of countries. There are already some sentiments being expressed, but without getting into the details of this, how prepared are we as a country? Now that is going to determine. So if the government, my suggestion to the government would be spend very, very heavily on the infrastructure so that we make ourselves attractive, spend very, very heavily on research and development so that we can ensure quality product in whatever area that we go in, and look at this entire startup ecosystem, which is very, very vibrant, but requires a lot of funding. And there are multiple opportunities over here which can actually be exploited going ahead into the future.
Thank you so much, sir. Now, before we move on to the question from the audience, my last question is to Dr. Achyut Wagle. Dr. Wagle, you have been highlighting so much on the remittance and the monetary policies and its implication to the South Asian economy. My final question to you is, Nepal's foreign employment and the foreign currency reserve is largely dependent upon 2 parameters, remittance and tourism. And both these parameters accumulate to almost 36% of the total GDP. In past few years, we have witnessed increase in household consumption and standard of living amongst people in rural areas of Nepal, which was the ultimate result of growth in tourism sectors and migrant remittance from the Middle East and other countries. Now the remittance is decreasing, the tourism industries are closed. So how will these situations influence the standard of living? And where do you think our economy will head towards? And finally, what will be your suggestion to the government to manage the migrant workers after they come back to Nepal? Dr. Wagle.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. First of all, as regards the foreign currency earning, yes, we are getting the foreign currency at the tune of $8 billion, plus and minus $8 billion, which is enough to finance half of our imports, tentatively half of our imports. So in the changing context, since our largest import is petroleum, the price of the petroleum have gone down drastically, and it is likely to remain that way for at least for some time. And the consumption, the demand itself has gone down. So that means the need of our foreign currency based payment is also going to be little less. Second, we must assume that the sectors like tourism and education particularly, it is ubiquitous to everywhere, I guess. The revival will be very slow. For two reasons: people will not be ready to spend immediately. People may not be feeling free to travel freely, and then even in the originating countries like US and the other European countries where the tourist, the quality tourists generally originate, they would not be very immediately traveling. So that source is not there. But again, I would like to go back to the same thing. We have got a huge amount of unspent budget in terms of the capital expenditure. We have in last 10 months, we have spent only a quarter of our allocated capital expenditure. Although we are very short of collecting revenue, but still we'll have about $2 billion extra to spend for the development. So only thing we need to do is to refocus that expenditure where we can spend. When I say that, I see three areas, potential areas where we can instantly spend: is the healthcare infrastructure, agricultural value chain, and the relief and social security of the vulnerable population. So that is one aspect. When we talk, we have always cursed our subsistence agriculture, not being able to produce a lot. But when you look at, we are acknowledging the fact that already 70% people are occupied in the agriculture. They are surviving, not being able to produce extra, but they are surviving. That also provides a sort of resilience. So if government is able to come out with some small marginal package of support, there is going to be a huge boost to their morale, and the agricultural products can come into the market, not only as a consumption, as a backward link to the agro-based industries, which is very, very key. Dairy products, juice products, and the other high-value fruit products like avocado and kind of things. So third, I think it is, I already mentioned that this is the opportunity to modernize the agriculture, to invest into agriculture, because even by the contagion, the villages are the least affected. Their agricultural activity is going on. One good thing is the people coming back from Korea, coming back from Israel, coming back from several European and Gulf Cooperation Council countries who have worked in sort of modernized agriculture, who are likely to bring in their knowledge, techniques, so that if government can make, it also asks to your question what government should do. If government can recognize these skills and make them the people who actually create opportunities for employment and the agricultural modernization by financing on their skills, not against the collateral or anything. So if that can be done, I think the current crisis can be handled in many ways. It can address the unemployment and both unemployment and the agricultural produce. And final point to your question, not going into the large detail, is the government must not try to do away with the policy-based incentive and stimulus. There must be the cash stimulus that get transferred to the people. I have said that needs to be categorized, classified in 5 or 6 categories. The people who need support for basic survival, people like the taxi drivers who need support to pay their installment, who have bought taxis from the banks, and there are the consumer loans. What will happen? And the most important segment, which constitutes about the 3/4 of our economy, is small and medium enterprises. I mentioned it before, but they are very key. And then they need a separate type of stimulus package support, not only the tax holiday or interest rate rebate. They are at the verge of closing down in need of the additional capital to restart, even if the COVID crisis over. So they should not be compared with a large kind of businesses who have earned billions in say in good times, and now looking for the opportunity to take advantage of the similar kind of universal type of stimulus packages. So that is my take. I think it's going to be long. So I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wagle. Now I move on to Jagdish Bist to take up the questions from the audience. I think we have some questions from the audience. So before we wrap up, we'll take a few questions from the audience and we'll try to wrap up this discussion. Jagdish, sir, to you.
Thank you, Saji sir. Now we'll be taking some questions either from the participants or from Facebook Live. And it is my humble request, with due respect to our panelists, if you could make answers within a few minutes, 2 or 3, because we are already running out of time now. So I have a question here. I think this question will suit to Professor Salim from Bangladesh. Professor Salim, someone is asking about the supply chain disruptions within the South Asian region. You know, some countries even putting some restrictions on the medicines, critical medicines these days on their export. So how do you think these things are going to affect what we have now?
First of all, definitely there should not be any supply restriction, especially the point I made that this is the time now the South Asian countries should cooperate. You know, we didn't have very good experience or good memory of regional cooperation, but I think in the crisis time, this is and kind of willingness which has been shown by our political leaders. I think this is the time when we should exploit this, and I'm quite against of any kind of restriction like this, especially with respect to these pharmaceutical products. And as I mentioned earlier, that South Asian countries, they must cooperate on the health sector. I just want to remind one thing, that look, in the South Asian countries, they are not really investing quite a lot on the public health system, and they spend probably very low on the public. The public spending on health is very low. For example, in Bangladesh is 0.5% of GDP, and probably Nepal or India has a bit of higher percentage. But when it comes to the region as a whole, I think compared to Southeast Asian countries or any other region in the world, we'll see that the public health spending is very low. So which is also has put a lot of pressure on us that, the crisis which we are witnessing now, it's not we can't find a private solution here. It's a crisis, it's a pandemic where you need to have a well-developed public health system. And we are seeing that the private health system or the private hospitals, they are not really very much accountable to kind of, face this crisis. So here I see that the very need of regional cooperation and to look for what are the bottlenecks are, how we can remove them very quickly. And crisis actually force the elites to come out of their comfort zone. I think that our elites in all countries, and most of them are they are out of their comfort zone. And this is the high time for cooperation. I very much look forward to this cooperation. Over to you, Jagdish.
Well, thank you, Professor Salim. Now I have a question here on the comment box. And it is still open to all the panelists. If you could, anyone make some note on this. Now the question is how this, the education sector is going to get affected and will be dealing with this pandemic in this current scenario.
Okay, I think I'll field it because this is something that we have been grappling with, and all my previous webinars have been around this. So I think there are 2-3 things which are going to happen so far as education is concerned. And in particular, I'm talking about the higher education. One is that it's a no-brainer that we are moving towards online education. So we'll see more and more of blended programs coming in, even when it comes to flagship programs or executive management programs. Second, what I see is that in any case, we were slowly moving towards an autodidactic mode. So far as education was concerned, we're moving towards an autodidactic world where the participants are going to choose as to what is it that they wish to study and in what form do they want to absorb and consume the content. And one of the studies has actually established that going ahead in the next 3 to 4 years, almost 70 to 80% of the content is going to be consumed in form of audiovisual. And therefore, what I also see happening is more of audiovisual content coming in. So for example, most of the world of management uses something called the case method in terms of their pedagogical tool. But what we are increasingly seeing is that even these cases are being written partially with an audiovisual component to it. So apart from having the storyline, which calls for a decision making, you also have audiovisual, either interviews or scenes being brought in from the organization, or what the organization was doing or what it should be doing in forms of interviews and facts, etc. So that is the second thing. And the third thing that I see is likely to happen is that, and this people may find a little counterintuitive, but when it comes to a depression in the industry, I think the investment in education goes up from individuals. So more people are going to come, especially for the executive programs, because they believe that given that the opportunities in the industry are less, this is the time for them to update their skills. And this is the time for them to get that degree that they could not find time for, or they did not think that it was necessary for them to get so. Why? Because the nature of the jobs itself is going to change. And it would have changed whether it were for this pandemic or not, it would have changed. And therefore, very quickly, the world over, people need to update their skills, and they need to look at those skills which are going to be relevant in the post fourth industrial revolution. So that very nature is going to change. And given that, there will be opportunities in education, especially higher education, for people to step into this space with blended programs, go into the online mode, and make sure that they make the workforce future ready.
Thank you, Professor Rai. Now, let me turn it to the participants we have in this room. So I'll be turning some mics on here. And anyone would like to make any questions to any panelists? Yes, please. So let me turn, I'll be asking these questions. I have some other here. Now, I think this question will be good for Dr. Valerie. Dr. Valerie, questions are coming in that how do you think these banking institutions or the central bank will play a major role during these pandemic period?
Yes, sorry, could you, the banking insurance, you say, what
banking, the role of, either central bank or the banking institutions.
Okay. Yeah, so yeah, I mean, it's the central banks are absolutely crucial. First of all, by definition, they have the possibility of, the liquidity, the possibility of infusing liquidity into the economies. And one of the issues that we've actually looked at recently in a publication in more depth, one of my colleagues has, is the role of state banks. So a lot of the South Asian countries have had very large state banks that have had some, large performing loans in the recent past, and it's been something that the governments have been tackling with to sort of free that up. It has affected, for example, the supply of credit. But again, as we are living in non-normal times, we're finding that these banks, the state banks, for example, may be a very good vehicle to allocate some of the funds. Some people have said yes, and I completely agree that cash transfers are going to be absolutely essential. But the problem is that not every country has the kind of infrastructure required to be able to do those quickly and to be able to do a good targeting. If you had a situation where you had already had universal IDs, then that might be you may already have a mechanism to do that. And there are countries that are working as much as possible with, for example, cell phone banking and other types of digital banking that start to get going on that. So you have central banks which are which will be providing most of the liquidity and working with what are the banks that need the most. Then you have state banks that are able to reach rural areas, especially in places that are generally not well served by normal private commercial banks. And then any advances in digital banking, I know in Bangladesh there's been a lot of progress in that, all of these things are going to be absolutely essential to, as much as possible, the question is not whether we should spend or not right now as much as possible, but there is an issue that fiscal space is not as large as some countries actually came in with hardly any fiscal space in South Asia into this pandemic with that. And the markets may not be forgiving. When we come out of it, they may still be in similar. So even though it is very important to spend, and it's, for example, anything like getting volunteers, temporary workers to help out in the health sector, all these things are very important. But once we get out, it's going to be a monetary policy that's going to have a little bit more leeway in helping out. So very important.
Thank you, Dr. Valerie. Now I'm taking one question from audience. Prakriti CC is there. Now, Prakriti, if you can hear me, you can now ask your question. Prakriti, you have to unmute yourself first.
Yeah, now
Yeah.
you can hear me?
Yes, please go on.
Yes. So my question is to once again to ma'am. The billions of people are now in lockdown, bringing global economic activity to halt, and it's very different from 2008 and the Great Depression. Or top economics also explain that economic fallout from coronavirus is unlike anything we have never seen before. It's like some asteroid have hit the Earth. So what government around of the world are only planning the stimulus package and helping the citizens only, but what if like this pandemic continues over, we can see the scenario of the Great Depression and financial crisis, which continues for years and 2 years it continues. So regarding this coronavirus, also if this continues, suppose to 2022 or 2023, so what the world leaders have to think or act immediately now in order to save the economy? We are only focusing on just packages only, but what regarding the natural cause of this virus? So what we are focusing and what world leaders should do immediately if this continues like World War?
Okay, Prakriti, I think we have got your question. So
yes. Thank you, sir.
Now, thank you for your question. Now, I think she was asking it to Dr. Valerie again. Dr. Valerie, in a very short, what it look like the world if this pandemic continues?
Yeah, so I very much agree with we have so much uncertainty with the caller, and I think that again, this is a public global situation, and the response and the solutions are not going to come from some company. It's going to come from global leadership, and to the extent, and not only global leadership, but of course, country leadership as well. So again, we don't know how long this is going to last. We do know that there's going to be a lot of changes to the way people do things already. We talked about education. They're just even going to a store. They're little marks with social distancing. I mean, everyone is going to try. There's going to be a lot of experimentation, and people will try different things across different countries. Since we don't have universal testing, and no countries are, all countries are complaining that there's no test. This is many things that we're going to have to live with. But I think the solution are going to require whatever those may be, and I think on a day-to-day basis, a lot of things have to be decided in terms of how much go. The solution is going to come from, a lot of people are saying, oh, well, this is going to, heighten protectionism, and it may, but I want to take an optimistic view that I think that leaders that step up and actually start to find more global solutions are not only going to be able to help their own country, but are going to be able to really move ahead and make this what they call build back better, which is make it an opportunity to do things in a better way that we weren't able to do before. This sort of gave us a bit of a glitch to restart some things. One of the things, of course, is going to be climate change. That's something that, I mean, maybe some people are happy that they can see blue skies again. That's being one of the silver linings, but some of these things are going to have to come in. So, I think you may find, like in wars, that a lot of these global institutions do begin to take an important role, I hope.
Thank you, Dr. Valerie. Now, it's already been 2 hours, and I think we are almost done here. And now, I would like to thank all the panelists and our PGBM team here, especially our program leader, Arun Bajasarisa, assistant program leader, Sunita Basnet ma'am, and all our full-time faculties, members, Sajid sir, Anu ma'am, Projal sir, everyone over there in the digital team as well. And now at the end, to make a note here and for a vote of thanks, I would like to call upon our CEO of the British College, Mr. Rajan Kandil sir. So it is over to you.
Thank you very much. It has been very impressive session. I'm so glad, and I would like to especially thank all our very prestigious and distinguished panelists, Dr. Valerie Mercer-Blackman, Professor Himanshi Rai, Dr. Paul Kapik, Professor Wagley, and we have a Professor Salim Rehan. So it has been a very, very valuable. I think the time we've almost done 2 hours. So a very special thank to all of you. And I would like to thank all our colleagues from our master's programs, and also all our digital team. I'm very glad the British College has all our colleagues managed to put together such a valuable program through the online link during this unprecedented time. And my final remark is just everyone, I think this is a very different time, a very unusual time. Just stay safe, and hopefully we can just carry on to our normal business very soon. And best wishes to everyone.